Hello, ladies. What seems to be the problem?
She's stealing from my porch and messing with my mailbox.
That's not true. I didn't steal anything. You're the one calling me slurs.
Turn around and put your hands behind your back.
What? I didn't do anything, I swear.
Hands behind your back, man.
Sir, please, I'm telling
Cuffs are going on. We'll sort it out.
The call came in just before sunset, logged as a routine neighbor complaint, the kind of low-priority dispute that rarely triggered any real concern and almost never ended with someone being placed in handcuffs. It was described in bland, harmless terms: a porch, a mailbox, missing packages, a disagreement between neighbors that had escalated into raised voices. On paper, it looked forgettable, one of hundreds of similar calls that would pass through the system that week without consequence. But those were often the calls where judgment replaced investigation, where assumptions quietly hardened into decisions long before facts had any chance to matter. Before we go any further, pause here for a moment. Stories like this only disappear when people stop paying attention. If you're watching right now, take a second to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing doesn't cost anything at all. It's completely free, and it helps make sure moments like this don't get quietly buried. By the time the patrol car pulled up, the evening light had softened the neighborhood into something that looked peaceful from the outside. Porch lights glowed warmly against the blue-gray sky, shadows stretched across the driveway, and nothing about the scene suggested conflict to anyone passing by. Yet tension sat thick in the air, unspoken but unmistakable, carried in the rigid posture of the two women waiting on opposite sides of the frame. On the far right of the driveway stood the black woman, older, composed, and unmistakably professional in appearance. She wasn't someone who looked lost or uncertain, and she certainly didn't look like someone caught doing something wrong. Her clothing was conservative and intentional, the kind chosen by someone who spent her days in rooms where authority wasn't shouted but earned, where credibility mattered more than volume. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, hands visible, movements restrained. There was a calm about her that didn't come from indifference, but from long familiarity with pressure, the kind of calm developed over decades of being scrutinized, questioned, and expected to respond with precision rather than emotion. She had just returned home from work, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening and the familiar comfort of her own space. Instead, she found herself standing under a body camera, accused without warning, her ordinary routine abruptly reframed as suspicious simply because someone else had decided it was. On the far left, near the porch and mailbox, stood the white woman who had made the call. Her stance was firm, arms folded tightly against her body, chin lifted slightly, as if bracing herself for validation rather than inquiry. This was her house, her property, her narrative, and she stood with the confidence of someone who believed that placing a call was the same as establishing truth. There was no visible hesitation in her expression, no sign that she expected to be questioned or contradicted. She had already told her story once, into a phone, and now she waited for it to be enforced. The officer positioned himself between them, the body camera on his chest blinking steadily, silently recording every word, every glance, every decision that would later be slowed down, replayed, and analyzed by people far removed from this quiet driveway. His presence introduced authority into the scene, and with it, the power to shape what would happen next. His opening line was neutral, practiced, designed to sound impartial. "Hello, ladies. What seems to be the problem?" It was the kind of question that suggested balance, that implied both sides would be heard before any conclusions were drawn. The white woman answered immediately, as if the question had been meant for her alone. She gestured toward the porch, then toward the mailbox, her voice steady and certain as she accused her neighbor of stealing, of interfering with her mail, of crossing boundaries she claimed had already been crossed before. She spoke as though the facts were already settled, as though the officer's role was not to investigate, but to act. Each word carried the quiet expectation that being the one who called meant being the one who would be believed. When the black woman responded, her denial was firm and immediate, delivered without hesitation or embellishment. She hadn't touched anything. She hadn't taken packages. She hadn't gone near the mailbox. There was no confusion in her voice, no uncertainty, only clarity. And then she said the part that should have changed everything, the part that should have forced the situation to slow down instead of accelerate. She explained that the accusations were not new, that this behavior had been building, that she had been harassed before, and that she had been called slurs long before the police ever arrived. Her tone didn't rise when she said it. It didn't need to. The gravity of what she described should have been enough on its own. Allegations of racial harassment are not side notes. They are red flags that demand careful handling, documentation, and verification. They require separation of parties, follow-up questions, and an understanding that accusations can be weaponized as easily as they can be justified. That was the moment where the encounter could have taken a different path. It was the point where an officer could have paused, asked for clarification, requested evidence, or simply acknowledged the seriousness of what had just been said. Instead, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. The officer's body language changed, his attention narrowing, his stance turning away from the woman who had reported harassment and toward the woman now being accused. The command came abruptly, stripped of explanation and context. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. No follow-up questions. No request for clarification. No attempt to establish facts. The words landed heavily in the quiet driveway, heavier still because nothing had been proven and nothing had been checked. For a brief moment, shock crossed the black woman's face. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical, but it was unmistakable. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened anyone. She hadn't done what she was accused of. Yet in a matter of seconds, she had gone from homeowner to suspect, from neighbor to detainee, based solely on someone else's accusation. What made the moment even more jarring was who she actually was, a detail that had not yet entered the officer's calculations. She wasn't simply another resident in a neighborhood dispute. She was a federal judge, someone whose career revolved around weighing evidence, challenging unsupported claims, and enforcing due process with precision and restraint. In courtrooms, accusations like the ones leveled against her were examined carefully, dismantled piece by piece if they lacked proof. Here, standing in her own driveway, they were accepted instantly. As the officer stepped closer, the body camera capturing his movement, the imbalance of the scene became impossible to ignore. The white woman remained on the left, untouched, unchallenged, her role complete the moment she made the call. The black woman, older, accomplished, visibly composed, was treated as the problem to be removed rather than a person to be heard. This was how moments like these unfolded, not with shouting or chaos, but with quiet decisions made too quickly and authority exercised without reflection. The body camera continued to record, indifferent to fairness, capturing a version of events that would soon be scrutinized by lawyers, supervisors, and the public. And in that quiet driveway, under the steady blink of a small red light, the first link in a long chain of consequences snapped into place, consequences that would eventually cost a city far more than anyone standing there realized. This was only the beginning. By the time the officer's hand reached for the black woman's arm, the dynamic of the scene had fully shifted, even if no one had said it out loud. What had begun as a neighbor dispute had hardened into something far more serious, driven not by evidence or investigation, but by a decision that now carried its own momentum. The white woman stayed exactly where she was, on the far left near the porch, watching quietly as the situation unfolded in her favor, while the black woman stood on the far right, stunned by how quickly her words had been dismissed. Before we move deeper into what happened next, let me pause you here for a moment. If stories like this matter to you, take a second to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps make sure these moments don't disappear into silence. The officer guided the black woman forward, his voice firm but detached, as though the decision had already been finalized somewhere beyond the driveway. The body camera continued to record, capturing the subtle details that often said more than words ever could. The way her shoulders stiffened as she complied, the brief glance she cast toward her neighbor, the stillness of the white woman who no longer needed to speak. There was no attempt to check the porch, no effort to inspect the mailbox, no request for witnesses or footage. The accusation alone had been enough. As she turned, hands moving behind her back, the black woman spoke again, her voice steady despite the disbelief threading through it. She repeated that she hadn't stolen anything, that she had done nothing wrong. Her words weren't defensive in the way officers often expected. They were measured, almost procedural, as though she were instinctively treating the moment the way she treated disputes in her professional life. by stating facts clearly and waiting for reason to prevail. But reason never entered the equation. The handcuffs closed with a sharp metallic click, a sound that carried a finality far beyond its volume. It echoed briefly in the quiet neighborhood, louder than the distant hum of traffic or the soft buzz of porch lights overhead. For a split second, the officer hesitated, not enough to stop, but just enough for the camera to capture it. A pause that suggested awareness without correction. The white woman shifted her weight slightly, watching from a comfortable distance. She didn't need to add anything. Her role was complete. The system had validated her call, and with it, her version of events. There was no visible triumph on her face, no overt satisfaction, just the calm certainty of someone who had seen this outcome coming from the moment she dialed the phone. The officer began to escort the black woman toward the patrol car, his body positioning her slightly ahead of him, guiding her down the driveway. She walked without resistance, head high, steps controlled. There was dignity in her movement, even as the circumstances stripped her of it. Neighbors' windows reflected faint silhouettes, curtains shifting slightly as people watched without fully understanding what they were seeing. Inside the patrol car, the door shut with a heavy thud, sealing her into the back seat. The camera caught the officer's face briefly in the reflection of the window, expression neutral, unreadable. He radioed in the arrest, summarizing the situation in clipped language that flattened everything into something far simpler than it was. A theft complaint. A suspect detained. No mention of slurs. No mention of harassment. No mention of doubt. At the station, the tone remained unchanged. The black woman was processed with routine efficiency, fingerprints taken, personal items cataloged, questions asked that assumed guilt rather than explored truth. She answered calmly, clearly, repeating the same facts she had already stated in the driveway. She hadn't stolen anything. She had been accused falsely. She had been harassed. When she finally identified herself fully, the room shifted. The officer behind the desk paused mid-keystroke, eyes lifting from the screen. Names carried weight in law enforcement databases, and hers carried more than most. A federal judge wasn't a detail that could be ignored or brushed aside. It was a title that demanded immediate reconsideration, not because of privilege, but because of what it implied: scrutiny, accountability, and consequences. Whispers followed. A supervisor was called. The arresting officer was asked to step aside while others reviewed the report, the body cam footage already queued for playback. The narrative that had seemed so straightforward in the driveway began to fracture under its own thinness. As the footage replayed, the omissions became impossible to ignore. No evidence check. No verification. No acknowledgement of the reported slurs. The contrast between the certainty of the accusation and the lack of investigation grew starker with each passing second of recorded video. What had felt routine in the moment now looked reckless in retrospect. The black woman sat alone in a holding room while discussions happened beyond closed doors, her composure unbroken but her patience thinning. She had spent her career watching cases fall apart under less scrutiny than this. She knew how systems protected their own, and she knew how uncomfortable truth could be when it was recorded in high definition. By the time she was released, hours later, the apology she received was thin and procedural, offered without eye contact. Charges were under review. The situation was described as a misunderstanding. The language softened everything except the reality of what had happened. Before we leave this section, take another moment with me. If you believe this never should have happened in the first place, like the video, leave a comment with your reaction, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is free, and it helps ensure stories like this don't get dismissed as misunderstandings when they're anything but. As she walked out into the night air, free but far from unaffected, the black woman already understood something the department had yet to fully grasp. This wasn't over. The footage existed. The witnesses existed. And the decisions made in that quiet driveway were about to follow everyone involved far beyond it. The department treated the incident as finished the moment the black woman walked out of the station doors, released without formal charges, and handed a thin apology that felt more like a procedural requirement than an acknowledgement of harm. From their perspective, the immediate crisis had passed. No injury, no jail time, no headlines, at least not yet. But for her, the moment she stepped into the cool night air, she knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. She had spent her career watching institutions minimize their own mistakes, and she recognized the pattern instantly. Within hours, the body cam footage was already being copied, preserved, and flagged. Not because the department volunteered transparency, but because her legal team demanded it. The recording showed everything the written report tried to gloss over: the lack of investigation, the speed of the arrest, the complete disregard for her allegation of racial harassment, and the unmistakable moment when the officer decided who the problem was before any facts were checked. Frame by frame, the truth sat there, uncooperative and undeniable. Word began to spread quietly at first. Supervisors reviewed the footage in closed offices, faces tightening as the implications became clear. This was not a case that could be explained away as confusion or poor communication. It was a clear example of authority being exercised in the direction of convenience rather than justice. The officer had chosen the path that required the least resistance, and in doing so, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The white woman's story collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny. Security footage from nearby homes showed no evidence of packages being taken, no suspicious behavior, no reason for the accusation beyond assumption and bias. The mailbox had not been disturbed. No deliveries were missing. What had felt like certainty in the driveway dissolved into nothing more than an unsupported claim, one that should never have justified an arrest in the first place. As internal investigators pieced the timeline together, the questions became harder to ignore. Why hadn't the officer checked the porch? Why hadn't he asked for evidence? Why had the allegation of slurs been dismissed outright? Each unanswered question widened the gap between policy and practice, exposing a decision-making process driven less by training and more by ingrained bias. The officer was placed on administrative leave while the investigation expanded, a move the department framed as routine, but that carried heavier implications behind closed doors. His body cam history was reviewed. Past complaints resurfaced. Patterns emerged that no one could credibly deny anymore. What had happened in that driveway was not an isolated lapse. It was part of a broader problem that had simply gone unchallenged for too long. Meanwhile, the black woman refused to let the incident be quietly resolved. She understood that apologies without accountability were meaningless, and she had no intention of allowing the department to reframe what happened as an unfortunate misunderstanding. A civil lawsuit was filed, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The claim was clear and precise: wrongful arrest, violation of civil rights, and racial discrimination carried out under the color of law. As the case moved forward, media attention followed. Once the footage became public, there was no controlling the narrative anymore. Viewers watched in disbelief as the video showed a composed, older black woman being arrested without cause while the accuser stood untouched nearby. Legal analysts dissected the footage in detail, pointing out every deviation from standard procedure, every missed opportunity to de-escalate, every moment where discretion should have been exercised and wasn't. Public pressure mounted quickly. City officials issued statements promising reform. The department emphasized its commitment to fairness. None of it slowed the legal process. Depositions were scheduled. Internal emails were subpoenaed. Training records were examined. The deeper the case went, the clearer it became that settling quietly would be cheaper than defending the indefensible in open court. Eventually, the city agreed to a settlement of $4.5 million, paid from public funds, a figure that reflected not only the harm done to one woman, but the systemic failure that allowed it to happen at all. The announcement came with carefully chosen words about moving forward and rebuilding trust, but the number spoke louder than any press release ever could. The officer did not return to active duty. His employment ended without ceremony, pension benefits reduced, career permanently stained by a decision that had taken seconds to make and years to unravel. The white woman who made the false accusation faced consequences of her own, her credibility shattered, her actions exposed for what they were once evidence replaced assumption. For the black woman, the outcome was not about the money. Her record was cleared completely. Her reputation remained intact. She returned to her work as a federal judge with the same composure she had shown in the driveway, carrying the quiet knowledge that accountability, while slow, was still possible when truth was preserved. The body cam footage remained online, replayed millions of times, a stark reminder of how easily power can be misused and how expensive it becomes when institutions fail to correct themselves early. It stood as proof that injustice doesn't always arrive with chaos or violence. Sometimes it arrives calmly, politely, under porch lights at dusk. And before we end, take a moment to do something simple but important. If you believe accountability matters, like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is completely free, and it helps ensure stories like this continue to be told instead of quietly erased.